Welcome to the POCGamer Lore Diver podcast series, where every week I dive into the lore of some of the most popular game worlds in tabletop role-playing and video games. Remember to follow this podcast, and that you can support POCGamer directly through Ko-fi or my Patreon. This week, we dive into the lore of the Turami of the Forgotten Realms. Now, as usual, before we begin, please remember, all of this lore is old lore. Therefore, it is not canon until it appears in a 5th edition product, and can only be considered canon at your table if you want it to be. So be warned. Now let's get into it. The Turami are often a forgotten people in the Forgotten Realms. They're kind of tucked away up in the Vilhan Reach area. Not a lot of books cover that area. Not a lot of attention gets paid to that area. However, they are one of the most singularly interesting and hardcore groups on the planet. And here's why. It's not just because they exist where they exist, which is in a rough area of town in terms of hazards and dangers that are going on around them. I mean, until recently they had Chondath right there, and Chondath was not a friendly nation. They had Wemix down south, giant mountain range with a whole bunch of bad action going on the other side of it. Some less than hospitable people down in Hlondath, where there was snake cults taking over. It was a city where the Yuan Ti were openly in charge, more or less. And yet there's the Turami. How did they survive? How did Turmish make it through all of that? Well, the answer is that the people of Turmish have survived everything that the Forgotten Realms has had to throw against them, to the point where they are the successor state, the direct successor state, to not one, but 2 fallen empires from the deep, deep history, the deepest of antiquity of the Forgotten Realms of Faerun, period. And how do we find all this out? Well, we have to hit the lore. So the first appearance of the Turami comes to us in the Old Empires book. The Old Empires book is in 2nd edition, and it is a book detailing the empires of Mulhorand, there we go, Chisenta, and Unther. And Mulhorand, the one that I have the hardest time pronouncing properly, that's the one that we need to pay attention to, because this is where the Turami are first mentioned. Now, the Turami are a black people in the Forgotten Realms. They're one of the many black populations of the place. They're one of the few indigenous populations of the place as well. They didn't come from another dimension, or get warped in from space, or any of the other various ways that humans have arrived onto Faerun. And this book lays out something interesting in that, at least in 2nd edition, they were a part of the Mulhorandi Empire that weren't slaves. In fact, they were considered a middle class there. They were artists, artisans, and priests, most notably, which is very unusual because Mulhorand is a fairly xenophobic place, where if you're not Mulhorandi, you're in a bad way. That's where they first appear, and it's not the most auspicious beginning, but it's a beginning. And the next place that we can find information on them is in the 2nd edition book, which is the Vilhan Reach. The Vilhan Reach itself is a fascinating region. Lots of stuff going on there in terms of history. And it's where Turmish is. Turmish and Chondath, until Chondath got wiped off the map in 4th edition and then never recovered into 5th, were the only real powers in town as far as human controlled areas. And the Turami were sort of like a merchant group. There's some elf influence, there's some dwarves, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, but not a lot of stuff gets laid out. There is information. It does talk about Turmish quite a bit, gives you a map and all that sort of thing. You will not see a single person with dark-skinned identifiers in any of the art, which is a very 2nd edition thing, but that's where it's at. And it could have stayed there, but it didn't, because when 3rd edition came along, things got wild, because 3rd edition is where their actual history got laid out much, much, much more in detail, although not directly. Like a lot of the stuff that I found when researching lore in the Forgotten Realms, it's not so much about your ability to find information that directly pertains to what you're looking for. It's combing through related materials and finding snippets and bits and pieces that paint the larger picture. And wow, does 3rd edition do that for the Turami. So 3rd edition bumps the Turami's history all the way back to link up with the Empire of Imaskar. Now the Imaskari, they do still exist. There's like Deep Imaskar. In 4th edition, they came back to the surface. It was a whole thing. A lot of what, in my opinion, was some bad world building decisions went into bringing them back, and then how they got rid of them. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that Imaskar reaches all the way back to approximately 10,000 years before the modern day. Like, that was its founding. Very shortly after that, the peoples of Imaskar ran into the Turami. And it doesn't specify what happened or how it happened. But instead of conquering and enslaving the Turami, which had been the fate of other populations encountered around the Alambar Sea, instead they were absorbed. Like, they were brought into the empire where they lived. And this is very unusual because the Imaskari were all about that slaving life. I mean, they literally kidnapped humans from a real world fantasy Earth. Like, that's a whole other thing we should talk about later, to do with Unther and Mulhorand. But they were willing to go to those lengths to get slaves, and were not willing to try to enslave the Turami, which should give you some indicator about what the Turami were all about. Now, the Turami managed to survive everything that goes down with Imaskar right up until, like, minus 2,488. And that was when the Empire of Imaskar fell. And how it fell was pretty straightforward. The great overgod Ao heard the calls of the Sumerian and Egyptian gods who were trying to, like, get to their followers that the Imaskari had kidnapped, and then set up a magical barrier that prevented their gods from, like, finding them and getting to them. He lifts it partially to allow them to create basically like living avatars. There's a whole civil war. The Imaskari who survive are driven underground, and the Turami fight in what I would describe as being a brutal rearguard action against what I would describe as being not only numerically overwhelming, but also like magically overwhelming opponents. And they are actually able to fight and fall back in good order, to the point that a significant population of refugees of them not only made it to the Methwood, which is a name that will never not make me laugh, but also managed to make it to Jamdath. And Jamdath is the 2nd empire that they were a part of. Now, Jamdath is unique because it was a psionic empire in the Forgotten Realms. So they were all about psychic powers. They had a bunch of crystal sword cities, and suddenly they had this huge population of Turami show up who were fleeing the Untherites, who were the more violent of the two factions of former slaves of the Imaskar. And they said, sure, we'll let you live here. Have this place called Granite Gates. Or, correction, Granite Grates, because that's what went on the map, Grates. Anyways, so they get put up into what's essentially land that the Jamdath Empire isn't interested in. And they exist there. They're a part of the Empire, they're doing their own thing, living their lives, paying their taxes, setting up their cities, all that sort of thing. And everything's going great right up until minus 255 DR, when basically Jamdath has stepped on the wrong toes too many times. Their enemies summon a tidal wave and send it down what at the time was like a very small estuary, which is now the Vilhan Reach, and they drown everything. So just a pro tip for those of you who are planning to DM any games in that region: the Vilhan Reach is full of psychic ghosts and horrifying psychic phenomena, so have at it. Anyways, so that's the 2nd empire that they are heirs to. So they were part of the Imaskar Empire, they're part of the Jamdath Empire, and from there they fight all sorts of opponents. They fight Chondath on multiple occasions. They fight against elves. They fight against dwarves. They fight and get conquered by a dragon. All this is being spelled out in 3rd edition. And the best source for their more recent history in 3rd edition comes from the Grand History of the Realms book, which takes you right from minus 247 DR up to what was at that point the modern era, which was about 1370. And it's pretty straightforward. A lot of wild things happen, but they established themselves, well, I guess reestablished themselves. And their first real leader, according to this at least, was a guy named Dempster, which is a really unfortunate name because I'm not sure about my listeners, but in Canada, Dempster is a brand of bread and not usually a first name. From there, they become a major naval power. They do all sorts of stuff, get into fights with druids, a lot of nasty fights against the druid enclaves, and finally, there's some stuff with Malar and bad times. But that's where it all goes through 3rd edition. 4th edition, things fall apart again as they are wont to, because 4th edition broke the world. And not only did 4th edition break the world, but it tended to hit places where the people are of color a little bit harder than other places. The end result was that Turmish was turned into a landlocked state that was a failed state where everybody was paranoid and awful, and it was a place you didn't go. They made it as awful as they possibly could. But to their credit, they were also the first edition that actually showed Turami as being, as described in the books, that being black. So I guess 4th edition did do something for them at least. Now, finally, 5th edition, the water's back. They're no longer landlocked. Everything's being rebuilt. And there hasn't really been a lot of details about them since. Which takes us to the next part. Ideas. What can we do with the Turami? Well, the answer is quite a lot. The Turami were famous for their mercenaries prior to the whole spell plague thing and sundering and breaking of the earth. And there's no reason to assume they wouldn't be becoming famous for their mercenaries again. After all, people need mercenaries. People got to fight, and there's all sorts of conflicts going on around them. For example, the Untherites are currently waging war against Time-Anther, Time-Anther being the Dragonborn enclave that remained behind because apparently the Untherites didn't want to let them go. Again, whole other podcast on that one. Anyways, so Time-Anther probably going to be hiring the Turami of Turmish, and they are probably going to be down for it because they really do not like the Untherites. For deep historical reasons, mostly because the Untherites weren't satisfied just seizing land that was controlled by the Imaskari. They also went into the traditional lands of the Turami at the time. Another thing to do with them is lean into some of their trade aspects. The Turami were famous for trading, and not just trading, but being fair traders, which was a huge problem for a lot of their trading competition in the area. So places like Sembia and the other big trading houses, like Cormier, trading nations, Cormier, everything on the Dragon Coast pretty much, they're going to be oh man, Turmish is back, what are we going to do? Outside that, it's really sort of your own imagination. There's a lot of stuff in the books that's happening around them. There's volcanoes, haunted forests, as I mentioned, all the psychic nonsense that's left over underneath the Vilhan Reach itself, and of course there's the Imaskar connections as well, because they got along well with the Imaskari in deep antiquity. They were friends, and I don't see a reason why in 4th edition that link wasn't reestablished. It wasn't, but in your game you may want to establish that. So you may have a population of Imaskari refugees now living there because they had to flee somewhere when the god kings of Malhoran reappeared and started doing their thing, and nobody wanted to be around the Untherites when they started doing their thing. So yeah, there may be an instance of a large number of Imaskari there, continuing to live their lives and, trying to be part of the realms. And I think that about sums up what's going on with them. The only recommendation I have on the personal side is that there's some stuff in the 2nd edition about them having, spiky minaret deals on all their armor. Don't do that. Please don't do that. Don't be that person who puts things like that onto people. That's not cool. And yeah, I think that sums up this one. So this has been a brief look at some of the lore for the Turami of the Forgotten Realms. Thank you very much for listening if you still are. I hope you enjoyed this week's content. And don't forget to check out the POCGamer website. Follow POCGamer on social media. And I need to send out a huge shout out to my Patreon and Coffee supporters for making this all possible.